Hello everyone, I'm John with JP Strategic Investments, and today I'm going to go over Patriot One Technologies shareholder letter that was just released today. I'll go over everything in the letter and give my analysis on what it means for the company and the stock going forward, and as always, if you enjoy videos like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and with that out of the way, let's dive right in. So Peter starts off the letter by addressing some concerns from shareholders that the company has been, quote, quiet recently with no major news or announcements since the earnings report. Now, I'd like to point out here that Peter has already stated in his prior letter that he will not make any announcements unless they are meaningful to the company and shareholders, and he doesn't want to give investors false hope on a deal or partnership that could potentially fall through. He goes on to explain this further in this letter, saying that, quote, "First, my primary focus for the business has been to establish repeatable, predictable, and sustainable revenues for the company, and only then announce material customer wins and product launches that are the source of these revenues. This means that announcements of new customers won't likely happen until a contract is actually signed, or potentially not even until we see the revenue show up on the income statement. To be honest, as an investor, I appreciate this. I'd rather know that any customer the company announces will be bringing in meaningful revenue rather than having to determine whether or not I think the deal will eventually go through." Another thing we have to keep in mind is that Patriot One's competitors are reading these letters and announcements as well, and they are looking for any chance to steal potential customers. And one last thing to point out here is that because of the nature of Patriot One's products, there are many customers that would probably rather not disclose the type of security system they have installed, and so Patriot One may not even be able to announce some of their larger contracts. Another good sign in the letter here is that Peter is taking a hands-on approach and actively seeking out new customers. He has been traveling across the US for the past 50 days, meeting customers and partners, as well as completing site surveys and working towards negotiating pilots and contracts. In my opinion, the fact that the CEO himself is on the front lines with his sales team, actively seeking out customers, says a lot about his work ethic and his motivation toward the success of the company. The next important thing that Peter mentions in the letter is the complexity of the sales cycle. He states that the typical engagement will progress through site surveys, trials, and pilots, sometimes in multiple locations, a redesign of the customer's security operations, IT integration, proposal negotiation, and contracting and budgeting. This is one of the downsides of Patriot One's products and business model. It's not like a potential customer can approach Patriot One and have everything they need installed and running within a matter of days. It can often take weeks or even months to go through the entire process of determining the specific needs of each customer, putting a pilot together, testing the pilot, and then finally moving forward with the contract. Now, it is important to note here that Peter makes several mentions of the high-quality pipeline of interested customers that Patriot One is building. The reason that this is important is that while the drawn-out customer acquisition process will make the sales ramp process slower, once the sales start to come in and the pipeline is steadily feeding those sales, the longer sales cycle will become less relevant, especially as Patriot One starts to move towards a subscription pricing model similar to those of other software-as-a-service companies that Peter mentioned in the last webinar. This will bring in steady recurring revenue that is more predictable. The next thing Peter noted was their demonstration day in Vegas that Peter said was highly successful. He says that the attendees range from a security consulting organization for major pro sports leagues to representatives from the entertainment industry to a number of casinos, and that the demo day activities have led to requests for pilots for 3 pro sports arenas and a major global entertainment and casino organization. This is great to hear, and it's especially promising that they're already moving forward with pilots with the major sports arenas and casinos. What Peter mentions next here is also very interesting though, and should not be overlooked. He says that along with these new opportunities, they've also received valuable industry-specific feedback on refinements to the products to allow for a wider deployment of applications. Some of you may remember something very similar in the last webinar.
And so if I think about an example, we're in conversations with a very large retailer about protecting their store from weapons, right? They were very highly impressed with what we were doing with VRS weapons, right? And the AI capabilities. They started asking about other possibilities to leverage it, sort of like Dietmar was alluding to. And they started to think about, well, could we integrate RFID detection at the doors? So we're looking for weapons on the way in, shoplifting from the way out, and we've got your visual identification that not only works on visually identifying people, but shoplifters. And then they started to think about, well, we already have camera systems. Can we use your AI platform to actually detect shoplifting while it's occurring in the floor? These are all very, very solvable problems with what we've got as a platform. We haven't productized those things yet, right? We're exploring the marketplace and looking at the kinds of things I talked about earlier about, is this a highly appealing and favorable market? And And if so, we'll start to think about that on a roadmap and make those announcements out to the investor community as we start to bring new platforms to these very significant vertical market needs, right?
I think this is something that is kind of going under the radar right now for Patriot One, and in my opinion, this is really going to broaden the long-term market for their products. I understand though, while this is very exciting, what investors really care about right now is revenue, and it's unlikely that further product announcements will have major effects on the stock price until we see some meaningful revenue growth. And speaking of that, the next portion of the letter seems to be implying that revenue should be coming in very soon. Peter mentions here that the interest is very high for Patriot One's products, which I will say we've all heard before. But he backs this up by saying that they currently have a number of customers in the late stages of their pipeline moving forward with site surveys, pilots, and even some that are currently in the contracting stages. Peter also mentions later in the letter that the marketing campaigns that they launched in January have been generating quality leads on a daily basis. For the current quarter alone, that would total to well over 60 prospective customers. And keep in mind that many of these customers are actively reaching out to Patriot One. Furthermore, Peter also informs us that they have had a significant inbound interest for their VRS products, a large portion of which is coming from companies who were unhappy with Patriot One's competitors' products and are now looking for a more effective solution. This is really great to hear, and hopefully Patriot One can take advantage of the opportunity their competitors have given to them here. Peter then adds a sentence to the end of this paragraph, which I'm sure he spent a lot of time debating whether or not to include. He states here that they are, quote, currently discussing with 3 states protection of schools and government buildings and multiple retail organizations. Now, we all know that signing a contract with a state could be huge for Patriot One because it's almost like signing potentially hundreds of schools and government buildings all at once. Although I do really want to caution investors to take this with a grain of salt because, as Peter has mentioned, these contracts can take a very long time and involve mountains of red tape. So while I don't think Peter would mention this without being sure he wanted to do so, I also want to caution investors not to get too excited about this just yet. The last thing I want to cover here before I give my final thoughts is the last bullet point in which Peter mentions that they have signed 3 new partners in the last month and they have pilots with all of them. By partners here, Peter likely means security or security consulting companies. This is pretty exciting because signing a contract with one of these companies is very similar to signing a contract with a state or a school district. If these pilots are successful, Patriot One would then have access to the entire client base of these security firms, meaning one sale here could potentially turn into many more without the need for added spending to acquire these new customers. So overall, I think there's a lot of really good news here and many things that Patriot One investors could be excited about. As I mentioned before, like many investors in the stock, the main thing I'm looking for right now is revenue. And while there was no specific mention of revenue in the letter, it made it very hard not to predict that at least some revenue should be coming very soon. I'm looking forward to the webinar in May, and I believe that the company is on the right track and that the stock will follow. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, please consider liking and subscribing. Other than that, see you next time and have a great day.